If you've ever found yourself crying laughing at a guy calmly explaining how hard it is to understand books, or if you've ever heard the phrase, "I like the idea of reading," and felt deeply seen, then today's book just might be for you. Today I'll be reviewing Big Dumb Eyes by Nate Bargatze. Welcome to Spencer Reads Everything. I'm your host, Spencer Duncan, and like most people, I came to know Nate Bargatze through TikTok and Reels, his deadpan delivery, those perfectly timed pauses, and his ability to make the simplest observations into full-blown stories have really made me laugh, and especially at plenty of inappropriate times. And of course, I saw him host Saturday Night Live, which was great, and I now use his George Washington skit in my history classes as a hilarious yet surprisingly insightful take on national identity. His book, Big Dumb Eyes, is exactly what you'd expect from a Nate Bargatze memoir. If what you expected from Nate, saying that he doesn't read and then writing a book about it, then you would understand why this is an appealing book and also why it is a walking contradiction. In other words, you may have heard him say in his special, "I like the idea of reading, I even buy books, but these books are the most words. Every book, you just open it and you're like, what are you talking about? And they don't let up. Every page, just more words. How about you put some blank pages in there? Why don't you let me get my head above water for 2 seconds? And as promised in this book, he does have some blank pages. However, if you listen to the audiobook, which he narrates, so I strongly recommend you go that route, you are also going to get some additional surprises in the audiobook. And of course, that's the kind of detail that makes this more than just a repackaged comedy special. This book is structured around Nate's life, which makes sense because his stand-up is already pretty autobiographical. I'm not nearly as funny as him, so here's just a quick bio recap. I don't feel the need to try to tell them in the same entertaining way that he does, but he grew up in Old Hickory, Tennessee. I believe that's about 30 minutes from Nashville. His dad was a magician who found religion in the 80s. Matter of fact, Bargatze jokes that he got his dad at the most Christian. As a side note, I am also a magician, and I met his dad at a convention before I even knew about Nate Bargatze. I'd maybe seen some clips of his already by that point, but I certainly did not make the connection. He has a younger brother and a much younger sister, and he had a rough start academically and professionally, and he's very open about not being the sharpest knife in the drawer. He had no idea what direction he wanted to go in life, but he thought comedy sounded entertaining. So after failing his first year of college, and I believe also taking nothing but remedial classes at another college, and then trying just odd jobs here and there, he moved to Chicago, where he worked on his craft until he decided that New York was the next step. Similar to Chicago, he headed to New York with limited means, but he stuck with stand-up and worked his way through clubs. I'm sure probably some cruise ships and some half-empty rooms. Actually, half-empty is probably a generous amount in your early days at anything. And then, of course, we now know him through his Netflix specials and, of course, hosting SNL twice. And so he is clearly having a moment. He has been married to his wife, Laura, since 2006, and they have a daughter, Harper, who some of his best lines are about. He says his wife reminds him that he needs to be her dad and not her friend, and he says, correction, she is my best friend. For those of you that aren't familiar with his stuff, well, first go watch some of his stand-up. He is very funny, but just so you know, his relationship with his wife is a big part of his act. His daughter as well, although I've heard him in interviews say that he actually is very careful about this stuff. He includes about his daughter. He does want to give her some privacy. So saying her name and then occasionally referencing, I think that really does leave a fair amount of information out. I think he wisely does that on purpose. Also, he is a big fan of bowling and golf. I believe he's actually pretty good at both, though he failed a bowling class in college. He will tell you about that, and I'll let you read that to find out more. He doesn't talk about it in this book, but he wants to open a theme park, which I would love to see. I believe he wants to call it Nateland, and I actually think that he's very serious about it. Coming from Nashville, I think there are several similar parks. Obviously, on the eastern side of Tennessee, you have Dolly World. I think that's probably a part of the inspiration. And then I think there was something else in Nashville itself that was a similar vibe. Some guy started a park, and he just thinks that it would be great to create something like that. And you know what? I think it'd be great if he did. I'd love to see it. So this book, it touches upon some of the stories that he shares in his stand-up, although I think he is very deliberate to not repeat any actual material. For example, his dad being a magician, his love of Vanderbilt and the time he went to a game way too early. But like I said, he really does not repeat the actual punchlines. He just kind of references the stories as far as I could tell. And as a matter of fact, he shares plenty of new stories that I really appreciated. And I don't really want to retell them here, but if you pick up the book, here are just some of the stories I enjoyed the most, just to give you a little bit, although I'm not going to give you the punchlines. That is something that he specializes in, so I will let him do that. One is probably his deceptive way of winning a science fair. I thought it was hilarious. He talks about how he's not exactly the brightest individual, yet he thought that this one year he was a genius and he was going to be incredibly successful. And he pointed to this time that he won a science fair. And well, just remember that his dad's a magician, and that played a bigger role in it than he probably intended it to. He talks about winning over his wife, and it involved a little bit of some karaoke. I enjoyed that story. And then, of course, his efforts in both Chicago and New York at trying to bring his small town values to the big city, or about the time he bowled 300, kind of. Again, these are all just some of the stories I enjoyed that I highly recommend that you go read or listen to the book to find out more about them. I was also going to make a list of some of my favorite lines, but I'm not Nate Bargatze, so I can't make them as funny. Plus, there's really too many of them. I mean, just go read it. It's very funny and it's very entertaining. To be clear, this book is very funny. It is hilarious. But there were some things about it that I really appreciated that I think were maybe quieter reflections underneath all of his humor. So first of all, he has his religious bits, and he definitely talks about religion and growing up with a very Christian dad. But he is never mocking religion, I don't think. I do think he is certainly willing to criticize some cultural elements of it, especially in a way where if you are not familiar with an atmosphere that doesn't have quite as much religiosity, then it can maybe lead to these humorous moments that you see, especially when he goes to places like Big City. But he also puts at the end of his written book, I didn't hear this in the audiobook, but I saw it in the printed book, that he does make a point when he thanks everyone that the first person he thanks is God. So he clearly is a religious person. And I think that he does a wonderful job at having that be an important part of his life. And he explains why. But it's also something that he does feel the ability to comment on when it creates humorous elements, especially in a cultural sense and not necessarily in a strictly religious sense. And I think any religion can feel that pressure and can certainly be a little wary of offending people. But I think that there's a true sincerity in his efforts in still being religious and also being able to be very observant about the impact of religion on ways that, again, may not have much to do with actual doctrine or dogma or anything like that, and just has to do with some of the idiosyncrasies that comes up from a homogenizing effect from a religion. And I think that's something that is really important that I appreciate that you can see. Again, he's not very explicit about most of it, but you can certainly sense it in his writing. And it was something that I appreciated because I do think that when people are trying to balance their values and they're trying to balance what's really important to them as they become public figures, like someone like Nate, it can be a real struggle. And I think that he does a very honest and sincere job at it. And I think this book is a very clear reflection of that. I also really appreciate that as funny as he is in this book, he has a good deal of discussion about just how much he loves his parents and how appreciative he is of his parents. And of course, he has funny stories about them, and he is going to make fun of things that are kind of odd about them. But it is also very clear that he's incredibly grateful for them. One thing that surprised me, something I wasn't aware of, is that his father actually had a very rough upbringing. And so he is very deliberate in pointing out the ways in which his dad overcame a really challenging upbringing and how he did not bring that into the family that he created, and how instead he helped to create an incredibly happy and foster an incredibly creative and clearly a funny and a humorous family. His father, in addition to being a magician, is a comedian in his own right. Although he uses magic in his act, he is a funny person. I haven't seen him perform, and I think Nate is, of course, quite funny as well. So I really greatly appreciate not just how much Nate loves his father, but how you can see the deliberate work and effort that his father did in creating a quality person. And I think it shows up. I think Nate is famous for his act being clean and family friendly, and he even says that that's something that he does on purpose. And I've seen plenty of comedians that are also considered family friendly, but sometimes I just don't like them as much. And it's not necessarily because they're family friendly, but maybe I just don't connect with them in the same way. I feel like Nate is clean and he is family friendly. And having heard him talk about it, it is something that is at top of mind, but I also think it's in part, it's born out of his sincerity and not out of just a deliberate effort of trying to still remain appealing to a larger audience. I think it is just because that's the type of person he is. And again, I think the family life reflects that. And so I think that that's an important reflection there that I picked up on, that it's not necessarily something that he is deliberately putting out there as an explanation, although he is, again, very clear about how much he loves and appreciates his parents. And he would certainly credit much of his success to them and their love and their support. And I really think that's of great value. And that's probably one of the things that I enjoyed the most about this book beyond the humor of it. But of course, I really enjoyed the humor of it. I will say this is not a 6-hour version of a stand-up, as it should not be. But it is definitely Nate. It feels very Nate, at least in comparison to his stand-up persona. I think that makes it all the more worthwhile consuming because, again, you're getting great content, but it is also a little different. It is funny, it is self-deprecating, it is, like I said, sneakily sincere, and it's the only non-journal book I've ever read that includes blank pages just because. Who is this for? If you like Nate Bargatze and you like laughing, then you're going to love this. I'm on record of not liking most memoirs, but I think this is a very reflective one of Nate, and it's certainly worth a read for the laugh and, again, for those additional elements that I thought really added something to it. Who is this not for? Well, if you hate happiness, then it's not for you. So move along, go find something boring. I mean, if you are not familiar with Nate, if you've not watched any of their stand-up, again, go do that. But if you haven't, then maybe you won't quite appreciate this if you don't fully understand his persona, and especially if you're reading it and you can't get his voice in your head, you may not be able to fully understand exactly where he's coming from and how much he relies on pointing out how he just doesn't think he's all that bright. And I mean, to be fair, he gives good examples of why that might be the case. And again, watching him, you also get the sense of sincerity in him saying, I'm really not that bright. And you can trust it. Maybe if you were just reading that for the first time, you may not be able to fully take that in or fully respect that that is something that he seems to sincerely believe. Of course, the whole book is a running joke on the fact that he himself does not like reading. He says he wants to read, he likes the idea of reading it, but it's just something that he can't quite handle. And I think that he helps to explain why exactly that is. And I think he does a great job at that. I obviously love this. I thought it was great. I know that humor is pretty specific to individuals. So if you're not a fan of Nate Bargatze and you have heard his stuff, that's fine. You probably won't enjoy this. But if you are a fan of his, or if you have a broad interest in humor, then I do think that you will enjoy this. Please let me know your guys' thoughts about this book in the comments. I would love more suggestions about other good books by comedians. I know a lot of comedians write memoirs. I have read some of them. Again, like most memoirs, I don't actually usually love them, but I actually really did enjoy this one. I thought that it was incredibly well done, very reflective of the individual, and it did actually tell me a little bit about his life. And that's one of the things I struggle with some memoirs is they don't necessarily actually do a great job at telling you all that much more about their life. So please let me know your guys' thoughts in the comments, but do not forget to like, subscribe, turn on those notifications, and until next time, keep those pages turning.